October 15, 1945, in the bombed-out ruins of Frankfurt am Main, Germany. The autumn wind carried the scent of rubble dust and desperation through streets where skeletal buildings reached toward an overcast sky like broken fingers. Corporal James Washington of the 24th Marine Regiment adjusted his wool jacket against the morning chill as he made his rounds through the American sector, his boots echoing against cobblestones that had witnessed 4 years of conflict. The residents he passed averted their eyes, their faces gaunt with hunger and defeat, believing that the occupation forces would show them the same merciless efficiency their own military had once displayed across Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What James would discover in the ruins of a bombed bakery that morning would challenge everything both he and a desperate German mother believed about enemies, compassion, and the true meaning of victory in the aftermath of the most devastating conflict in human history. The morning patrol had begun like any other for James Washington, though nothing about his presence in occupied Germany felt routine. As one of the few black Marines serving in the post-war occupation forces, he carried not only the weight of his military duties, but also the complex burden of representing his race and his country in a land that had been taught to view both with hatred and fear. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled out his olive-drab uniform, James possessed a quiet dignity that commanded respect even from those who had been conditioned to see him as inferior. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, 23 years earlier, James had grown up understanding the cruel ironies of fighting for freedom abroad while facing segregation at home. His journey to Germany had taken him through the crucible of Marine Corps training at Montford Point, the segregated facility where black recruits learned to be Marines under conditions that would have broken lesser men. The instructors, both black and white, had demanded perfection because they knew these Marines would face scrutiny that their white counterparts never would. Every action, every decision, every moment of service would be measured not just as a reflection of individual character, but as evidence of an entire race's worthiness. The war in the Pacific had tested James in ways that no training could have prepared him for. He had landed on Iwo Jima with the 5th Marine Division, though as a member of a support unit rather than an assault force. The Marine Corps, despite allowing black enlistment, still relegated most African American Marines to support roles, convinced that they lacked the courage or competence for frontline combat. James had carried ammunition to white Marines who were fighting and dying in the black volcanic sand, had helped evacuate wounded men who sometimes looked at him with surprise that a black Marine was risking his life to save theirs. Now, 6 months after victory in the Pacific and 5 months after Germany's surrender, James found himself part of the occupation forces in a country that needed to learn what democracy and human dignity actually meant. The irony was not lost on him that he, a man denied full citizenship rights in his own country, was now tasked with teaching the principles of freedom and equality to a defeated enemy. The Frankfurt sector that James patrolled encompassed roughly 12 square miles of urban devastation. The Allied bombing campaigns had left entire neighborhoods as moonscapes of rubble and twisted metal. The Alte Oper, Frankfurt's historic opera house, stood as a hollow shell, its elaborate facade still partially intact, but its interior completely gutted. The cathedral's spires still reached skyward, but their shadows fell across streets where families lived in cellars and makeshift shelters. The statistics of destruction were staggering. Frankfurt had endured 33 major air raids during the conflict, with the most devastating occurring in March 1944, when nearly 1,000 bombers had dropped over 2,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries on the city center. The result was a firestorm that had consumed over 90% of the old town, leaving behind a wasteland that would take decades to rebuild. For the German civilians who remained, survival had become a daily struggle that reduced human existence to its most basic elements: finding food, staying warm, and avoiding the diseases that flourished in the ruins. The official ration for German civilians provided only 1,000 calories per day, barely sufficient to sustain life and far below what was needed for the physical labor of rebuilding their shattered city. Black market trading flourished in the shadows, where a single cigarette might purchase a meal and a bar of chocolate could feed a family for days. James had witnessed the desperation firsthand during his 6 weeks of patrol duty. He had seen children with hollow cheeks and old eyes, their clothes patched and repatched until they resembled quilts more than garments. He had watched elderly men and women searching through rubble for anything of value, their movements slow and deliberate as they conserved energy their undernourished bodies could not spare. The American military government had established strict regulations governing interaction between occupation forces and German civilians. Fraternization was officially prohibited, though the rules had begun to relax as the initial fever of victory cooled into the practical realities of governing a defeated nation. Still, James understood that his position as a black Marine made every interaction potentially explosive. White Germans who might grudgingly accept authority from white American forces often reacted with confusion or hostility when faced with black soldiers in positions of power. The bakery on Bergerstrasse had been one of Frankfurt's most prosperous before the conflict transformed it into another casualty of war. Heinrich Müller had operated the establishment for 23 years, serving fresh bread and pastries to a neighborhood that had once bustled with middle-class families and small businesses. The building's ground floor had housed the retail shop and ovens, while the Müller family lived in the apartment above. The bombing raid of March 22, 1944, had changed everything in a matter of minutes. High-explosive bombs had collapsed half the building, while incendiary devices had started fires that consumed what remained. Heinrich Müller had not survived, trapped in the basement where he had sought shelter from the attack. His wife Anna had escaped with their 8-year-old daughter Greta, but they had lost everything except the clothes they wore and the memories of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Anna Müller, now 32 years old, had spent the past 18 months living in the cellar of a partially destroyed apartment building 6 blocks from her former home. The space she shared with Greta measured roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling so low that Anna could not stand upright. They had furnished their underground refuge with salvaged furniture and belongings gathered from the ruins, a table made from wooden crates, beds constructed from bricks and salvaged mattresses, and a small coal stove that provided heat when fuel could be found. The transformation from comfortable middle-class housewife to scavenger and survivor had tested every assumption Anna had held about herself and her capabilities. Before the conflict, her greatest concerns had involved household management, Greta's education, and the social obligations of a baker's wife. She had been proud of her cooking abilities, her skill at managing the family finances, and her reputation as a reliable member of the neighborhood community. The collapse of Germany had stripped away all such conventional markers of identity and success. Survival now required skills that Anna had never imagined needing: how to identify edible plants growing in bomb craters, how to trade clothing and personal possessions for food, how to repair damaged clothing with scraps and thread, how to keep a child's spirits up when the future offered only uncertainty and hardship. Anna's appearance reflected the toll that 18 months of malnutrition and stress had taken on her body and spirit. Once plump and rosy-cheeked, she now weighed perhaps 90 pounds, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost all traces of feminine softness. Her blonde hair, which had once been her pride, now hung limp and lifeless, cut short for practicality rather than style. Her hands, which had once been smooth and well cared for, were now rough and scarred from handling debris and makeshift tools. Despite the physical transformation, Anna's blue eyes retained a fierce determination that reflected her absolute commitment to keeping her daughter alive and healthy. Every decision she made, every risk she took, every compromise she accepted was measured against a single standard. Would it help Greta survive another day, another week, another month in a world that had become hostile to their very existence? Greta Müller had celebrated her 10th birthday 2 weeks earlier with a gift that would have seemed insignificant in the old world, but represented incredible luxury in their current circumstances. An apple that Anna had obtained by trading her wedding ring to an American soldier who had been moved by the child's obvious hunger. The fruit had been the first fresh food Greta had tasted in over a month, and she had eaten it slowly, savoring each bite while her mother watched with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. The little girl had adapted to their circumstances, with the resilience that children often display in the face of adversity. But Anna could see the toll that constant hunger and uncertainty were taking on her daughter's development. Greta was small for her age, her growth stunted by malnutrition and chronic stress. Her personality, once bubbly and outgoing, had become cautious and watchful. She spoke in whispers, as if afraid that drawing attention might bring danger, and she hoarded small treasures, a bent spoon, a piece of colored glass, a button, as if these insignificant objects might somehow provide security in an insecure world. The American occupation forces had established distribution centers where German civilians could receive their official food rations, but the allocation barely sustained life, and certainly did not provide the nutrition that a growing child required. Anna supplemented these rations however she could, sometimes by trading labor for food, sometimes by selling or bartering the few possessions they had managed to salvage, and increasingly by taking risks that would have been unthinkable in her former life. The morning of October 15th had begun with Greta complaining of stomach pains that Anna recognized as severe hunger. Their official rations were exhausted until the next distribution, scheduled for 3 days later. Anna had searched their small refuge for anything of value that might be traded for food, but they had already sold or bartered everything except the most essential items needed for basic survival. Desperation had driven Anna to consider options that would have horrified her previous self. She had heard whispers among other survivors about American supply depots, where food was stored in quantities that seemed almost miraculous to people who had not seen abundance in years. The stories described warehouses filled with canned goods, fresh vegetables, meat, bread, and chocolate, enough food to feed hungry families for months. The moral implications of stealing from the occupation forces troubled Anna deeply, but her daughter's welfare outweighed abstract considerations of right and wrong. The Americans had conquered Germany, had destroyed her city, had killed her husband, and had reduced her family to near starvation. Taking food from their supplies seemed less like theft than like claiming compensation for losses that could never truly be repaid. The abandoned bakery on Bergerstrasse had become an unofficial storage facility for American military supplies that were awaiting distribution. The building's partially intact basement provided secure storage for non-perishable items, while the ground floor served as a temporary checkpoint where occupation personnel could rest during their patrols. Anna had observed the facility for several days, noting the patterns of guard rotations and identifying times when the building appeared to be unoccupied. Her plan, such as it was, relied more on desperation than strategy. She would enter the building during what appeared to be a gap in the patrol schedule, take only enough food to keep Greta alive for a few more days, and disappear back into the ruins before anyone noticed her presence. The risk was enormous. Theft from American military supplies could result in severe punishment, possibly including imprisonment or worse, but the alternative was watching her daughter slowly starve while abundance sat locked away behind American guards. James Washington had been patrolling his assigned sector for approximately 2 hours when he noticed the figure moving through the shadows near the damaged bakery. His training had taught him to be observant of any unusual activity, particularly in areas where military supplies were stored, but something about the furtive movement suggested desperation rather than organized theft or sabotage. Moving carefully to avoid detection, James positioned himself where he could observe the building's entrance while remaining concealed behind a pile of rubble that had once been part of a neighboring structure. The debris provided excellent cover while offering clear sightlines to anyone approaching the bakery from any direction. What James saw challenged his expectations and professional assumptions about security threats. Instead of the organized criminals or black market operators that intelligence briefings had warned about, he observed a single woman moving with the cautious determination of someone who had been pushed beyond normal boundaries by circumstances she could not control. Anna Miller approached the bakery with her heart hammering against her ribs and her mouth dry with fear and anticipation. She had left Greta sleeping in their cellar refuge, promising herself that she would return within 2 hours with enough food to ease her daughter's hunger for at least a few days. The weight of that promise drove her forward, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her common sense. The building's main entrance had been secured with American military locks, But Anna had identified a smaller entrance through what had once been the bakery's delivery area. The door had been damaged in the bombing and hung slightly askew in its frame, creating a gap just wide enough for a thin person to squeeze through without having to manipulate the lock mechanism. Anna approached the damaged door with every sense alert for signs of danger. She could hear her own breathing, unnaturally loud in the morning silence, and the distant sounds of traffic and machinery from other parts of the occupied city. Her hands shook as she examined the gap in the door frame, calculating whether she could fit through the opening without getting stuck, or making noise that might alert any nearby guards. The decision to proceed felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss of unknown consequences, but Greta's hollow cheeks and desperate hunger provided the courage that Anna's rational mind could not supply. She squeezed through the gap in the door, feeling splinters catch at her worn clothing and scrape against her undernourished frame. The interior of the bakery basement revealed wonders that seemed almost supernatural to someone who had not seen such abundance in over a year. Wooden crates and metal containers were stacked in neat rows, their contents labeled in English that Anna could not read but whose purpose seemed obvious from context and appearance. The smell of the stored food, canned vegetables, preserved meats, dried fruits, coffee, chocolate, created an almost overwhelming sensory experience for someone whose diet had been reduced to subsistence rations and foraged supplements. Anna moved through the stored supplies with a mixture of awe and guilt, her practical instincts warring with moral concerns that seemed increasingly abstract in the face of such plenty. She had intended to take only small amounts that might not be missed, but the abundance around her suggested that such minimal theft would be like taking cups of water from an ocean. Her hands moved almost without conscious direction, selecting items that would provide maximum nutrition for Greta, while remaining light enough to carry without difficulty. Canned milk, dried fruit, chocolate bars, crackers and tinned meat went into the canvas bag she had brought for the purpose. Each item represented days of improved nutrition for her daughter, the difference between survival and gradual starvation. The moral weight of her actions pressed against Anna's conscience, but she pushed such concerns aside with the ruthless pragmatism that had become necessary for survival. These supplies belonged to the army of occupation that had contributed to her current desperate circumstances. Taking enough food to keep her daughter alive seemed like a reasonable form of reparations for losses that could never be fully compensated. James Washington watched the woman's careful movements through the basement window, his training warring with a growing understanding of the desperation that had driven her to take such risks. He could see her obvious hunger in the way she moved, the careful economy of motion that suggested someone whose body was operating on minimal fuel. Her clothes, though clean and carefully maintained, hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost substantial weight. The regulations governing his duties were clear and unambiguous. Anyone caught stealing American military supplies should be arrested immediately and turned over to the military police for processing and punishment. The woman's actions constituted a clear violation of occupation authority and could not be ignored or overlooked without James himself facing disciplinary action. Yet something about the scene troubled James in ways that purely military considerations could not address. The woman's movements suggested maternal desperation rather than criminal intent. She was not taking large quantities or high-value items that might be sold on the black market for profit. Her selections appeared to focus on basic nutritional needs rather than luxury items or trade goods. James found himself remembering his own childhood in Birmingham, where economic hardship had sometimes forced his family to make difficult choices about survival versus social conventions. His mother had worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, and there had been times when pride had to be sacrificed to practical necessity. The sight of the German woman carefully selecting food for what was obviously a desperate situation triggered memories and emotions that complicated his professional obligations. The complexity of his position as a black Marine in occupied Germany added another layer to James's internal conflict. He understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion and hostility by people who had been taught to consider him inferior. He had experienced the dehumanizing effects of systemic discrimination and knew how such treatment could drive people to actions they would never have considered under normal circumstances. The woman in the basement was clearly not a hardened criminal or black market profiteer. She was a desperate mother, taking risks that her previous self would have found unthinkable, driven by circumstances that had stripped away all conventional options for survival. James recognized the desperation because he had seen it in his own community, had watched proud people forced to compromise their dignity for the sake of keeping their families alive. Military regulations demanded one response, but James's human understanding suggested that the situation was more complex than regulations could address. He could arrest the woman and turn her over to authorities who would probably impose punishment that would only worsen her already desperate situation. Or he could find a way to address the underlying problem that had driven her to theft in the first place. Anna Müller had filled her canvas bag with approximately 10 pounds of food supplies when she heard the sound that had haunted her nightmares for the past several days. Footsteps approaching the basement entrance. Her blood seemed to freeze in her veins as the reality of discovery and its potential consequences crashed over her like a physical blow. The bag of stolen food hung from her trembling hands, like evidence of guilt that could not be denied or explained away. There was no innocent explanation for her presence in the basement, no way to claim that her actions were anything other than theft from American military supplies. The punishment for such crimes could be severe, possibly including imprisonment, that would leave Greta completely alone and helpless. Terror and desperation paralyzed Anna's ability to think rationally about escape routes or explanations. She stood frozen among the stacked supplies, the stolen food weighing her down like an anchor that prevented flight even if flight were possible. Her mind raced through potential scenarios, each one ending with disaster for herself and abandonment for her daughter. The footsteps stopped just outside the basement entrance, and Anna could hear the sound of someone breathing, someone waiting, someone making decisions that would determine her fate and Greta's future. The silence stretched into an eternity of anticipation and terror, broken only by the hammering of Anna's heart and the distant sounds of the occupied city. When the basement door opened and light flooded the storage area, Anna saw a figure that crystallized all her fears and prejudices into a single moment of shock and recognition. The American soldier silhouetted against the morning light was clearly of African descent, tall and powerfully built, representing everything that German propaganda had taught her to fear and despise about the American military forces. Her first instinct was to drop the stolen food and throw herself on the mercy of someone who, according to everything she had been taught, would show no mercy to a German woman caught stealing. The racial theories that had been drummed into German consciousness for over a decade suggested that she was now at the mercy of someone who would treat her with the same brutality that Germans had been taught to expect from racially inferior enemies. James Washington entered the basement with his sidearm holstered and his hands visible, recognizing that the woman was terrified and might react unpredictably if she felt cornered or threatened. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening, designed to calm rather than intimidate someone who was obviously already pushed beyond her normal limits. The woman's reaction to his appearance did not surprise James, though it saddened him in ways that he had learned to push aside during his months of occupation duty. He had grown accustomed to the mixture of fear and revulsion that many Germans displayed when confronted with black American soldiers, the visible evidence of propaganda that had taught them to view African Americans as subhuman threats to civilization and order. What did surprise him was the woman's obvious desperation and the careful selection of food items that suggested maternal concern rather than criminal greed. Her clothes, though worn and patched, were clean and carefully maintained. Her posture, even in terror, retained a dignity that spoke to her previous circumstances and social position. This was not a career criminal or black market profiteer, but someone who had been driven to desperate actions by circumstances beyond her control. The canvas bag in her hands contained perhaps 10 pounds of food supplies, significant for someone facing starvation, but barely a fraction of the total stores in the basement. Her selections had focused on items with high nutritional value rather than goods that might be easily traded or sold. Everything about her appearance and actions suggested a mother trying to feed a hungry child, rather than a criminal seeking profit from theft. James made a decision that would have surprised his superiors and probably violated several military regulations, but which felt absolutely right in the context of his understanding of desperation, survival, and human dignity. Instead of placing the woman under arrest or demanding that she surrender the stolen supplies, he spoke in the calm, gentle tone that his mother had used when dealing with frightened children. "Ma'am," James said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority or threat that Anna had expected, "you look like you need that food more than we do." Anna Möller stared at the Black Marine in shock that transcended her terror and confusion. The words he had spoken in accented but understandable German were so far from what she had expected that her mind struggled to process their meaning and implications. According to everything she had been taught about racial hierarchies and American brutality, this encounter should have resulted in immediate arrest and severe punishment. Instead, she was hearing words of what seemed like understanding, possibly even sympathy, from someone who should have been her natural enemy on multiple levels. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that Anna wondered if stress and malnutrition were causing her to hallucinate or misunderstand what was actually happening. James could see the confusion and disbelief in the woman's expression, the struggle to reconcile her expectations with the reality of his response. He had encountered similar reactions from German civilians who had been conditioned to expect the worst from American occupation forces, particularly from black soldiers who were portrayed as barely controlled savages by German propaganda. "How long since you've had a decent meal?" James asked, his tone remaining gentle and non-threatening, despite the obvious violation of regulations that his question implied. He could see the woman's obvious malnutrition, the hollow cheeks and loose clothing that spoke to months of inadequate food intake. Anna's ability to respond coherently had been overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the encounter. She had prepared for arrest, punishment, possibly violence, but she had not prepared for kindness from a source that she had been taught to view as inherently hostile. Her voice, when she finally managed to speak, came out as barely more than a whisper. "I have a daughter," Anna managed to say, the words tumbling out in a mixture of German and broken English. "She is hungry, always hungry. The rations are not enough. I did not want to steal, but she needs food to live." The admission felt like a complete surrender, an acknowledgement of guilt that would surely result in severe consequences, but Anna found herself unable to maintain any pretense about her actions or motivations. The Black Marine's unexpected gentleness had somehow created a space where honesty seemed possible, even advisable. James listened to the woman's explanation, with growing understanding of the desperation that had driven her to take such risks. Her mention of a hungry daughter crystallized the situation in terms that transcended military regulations and racial barriers. This was a mother trying to keep her child alive, a motivation that James could understand and respect, regardless of nationality or previous allegiances. "How old is your daughter?" James asked, his question carrying genuine concern rather than official interrogation. He could see the woman's surprise at his continued gentleness, the way her defensive posture gradually relaxed as she began to realize that immediate punishment was not forthcoming. 10 years old, Anna replied, her voice growing stronger as she sensed that honest answers might lead somewhere other than arrest and imprisonment. "Her name is Greta. She has been hungry for so long that I'm afraid she will not grow properly. The rations they give us are barely enough to stay alive." James nodded slowly, his understanding of the situation deepening with each detail. A 10-year-old child needed substantial nutrition for proper growth and development, far more than the minimal rations allocated to German civilians. The woman's theft was not driven by greed or criminal intent, but by the most basic and understandable of parental instincts. "Where is she now?" James asked, though he was beginning to formulate a response that would address the underlying problem rather than simply punishing its symptoms. "She is sleeping in our cellar," Anna answered, her protective instincts warring with her growing sense that this American soldier might somehow represent help rather than threat. "She was too weak from hunger to come with me. I promised her I would bring back food." The image of a hungry 10-year-old girl waiting in a bombed-out cellar for her mother to return with food created an emotional impact that overwhelmed James's military training and regulatory obligations. He saw in Anna Müller not an enemy to be punished, but a mother driven to desperate actions by circumstances that no parent should have to face. James looked around the basement storage area, taking inventory of supplies that seemed almost unlimited compared to the desperate need represented by the woman and her daughter. The irony was not lost on him that abundance was being carefully guarded from people who were literally starving just outside the building's walls. "Ma'am," James said, making a decision that would have horrified his commanding officers, but felt absolutely right in the context of human decency and common sense. "I need you to take more food than what you have there." Anna stared at James in complete incomprehension, certain that she had misunderstood his words or their meaning. The statement was so far outside the range of possible responses that her mind could not immediately process what he might be suggesting. "I do not understand," Anna said slowly, her voice reflecting confusion rather than fear for the first time since James had discovered her in the basement. "More food." James moved deeper into the storage area and began selecting items with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood nutrition and practical meal planning. His selections focused on foods that would provide maximum benefit for a growing child: canned milk, protein sources, fruits, vegetables, and calorie-dense items that would help address months of malnutrition. "Her 10-year-old needs more food than what you have there," James explained, as he added items to a second canvas bag that he retrieved from among the storage supplies. "Growing children need proper nutrition, not just enough calories to survive." Anna watched in amazement as the Black Marine filled a second bag with food supplies, his selections demonstrating knowledge of nutritional needs and child development that seemed completely inconsistent with the propaganda image of American soldiers as brutal occupiers interested only in punishment and exploitation. "But this is stealing," Anna protested, her ingrained sense of right and wrong struggling to accept what was happening, despite her desperate need for exactly what James was providing. "You will be in trouble with your officers." James paused in his selection process and looked directly at Anna, his expression serious but not unkind. "Sometimes regulations and human decency point in different directions," he said carefully. "A hungry child is more important than military paperwork." The statement represented a philosophy that transcended military training and touched on fundamental questions about the purpose of authority and the obligations of those in positions of power. James had not forgotten his duty to the Marine Corps or to the American occupation mission, but he had identified a situation where blind adherence to regulations would perpetuate suffering that could easily be alleviated. "Why are you doing this?" Anna asked, her voice reflecting wonder rather than suspicion. "I am German. You are American. We are supposed to be enemies." James considered the question carefully, recognizing that his answer would reveal something important about his own character and motivations. "Because you are a mother trying to feed her child," he said simply. "That makes you a human being first, and everything else second." The response crystallized something fundamental about James's worldview and his understanding of the conflict that had brought them to this moment. The war had been fought over competing ideologies about human worth and dignity, about who deserved consideration and protection, and who could be dismissed or destroyed. For James, the answer was clear. Everyone deserved basic human consideration, regardless of nationality, race, or previous allegiances. Anna felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since her husband's death 18 months earlier. The unexpected kindness from a source she had been taught to fear and hate was emotionally overwhelming in ways that transcended simple gratitude. It challenged every assumption she had held about enemies, about racial differences, about the nature of authority and power. "I do not know how to thank you," Anna said, her voice thick with emotion that she could barely control. "This food will keep Greta alive for weeks. You are saving her life." James finished filling the second bag and handed it to Anna, along with the supplies she had originally taken. The combined weight was approximately 25 pounds of food, enough to dramatically improve a 10-year-old's nutrition for an extended period and give her body the resources it needed for proper growth and development. "You do not need to thank me," James said firmly. "You need to take care of your daughter and make sure she grows up healthy and strong. That is the only thanks I need." The generosity was so complete and unexpected that Anna struggled to accept it as real, rather than some kind of elaborate trap or test. "Are you certain this will not cause problems for you?" she asked, her concern for James's welfare surprising her with its genuine intensity. James smiled for the first time since entering the basement, his expression transforming his face from official authority to human warmth. "I will tell my officers that I conducted a thorough inspection of the storage facility and found everything secure," he said with gentle humor. "Which is technically true, since I am making sure the supplies go to someone who really needs them." The logic was dubious from a military perspective, but it demonstrated James's commitment to finding creative solutions that served human needs, rather than simply enforcing bureaucratic procedures. His willingness to take personal risk for the sake of a hungry German child spoke to character traits that had been shaped by his own experiences with injustice and his understanding of what true service meant. Anna carefully gathered both bags of food supplies, their weight representing more security than she had felt since before her husband's death. "How can I contact you if Greta needs more help?" she asked, realizing that she was assuming ongoing support that she had no right to expect. "You cannot," James said gently but firmly. "This has to be a one-time thing, for both our safety. But there are other American personnel who can help if you approach them correctly. Not all of us are interested in punishment for its own sake." The statement suggested that James's compassion was not unique among American occupation forces, that there were others who might respond to genuine need with understanding, rather than automatic punishment. It offered hope for future assistance, while acknowledging the risks that both James and Anna faced from this encounter. "How do I approach them correctly?" Anna asked, recognizing the practical importance of understanding how to seek help without triggering automatic rejection or punishment. James considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer might determine whether Anna could successfully navigate future interactions with American authorities. "Be honest about your situation," he advised. "Do not try to hide your need or make excuses for it. Most Americans understand what it means to worry about feeding children." The advice reflected James's understanding of American culture and values, his recognition that appeals to parental instincts and family protection often transcended political or racial barriers. It also demonstrated his faith in his fellow Americans' basic decency, despite his own experiences with discrimination and prejudice. "There is something else," James added, his tone becoming more serious. "Your daughter needs to understand that not all Americans are enemies, and not all Germans are beyond redemption. What happened here today should teach both of you something important about judging people as individuals rather than as representatives of groups." The statement carried profound implications for post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. James was suggesting that healing from the conflict would require both Germans and Americans to move beyond the stereotypes and hatreds that had fueled the war, to recognize shared humanity despite previous antagonisms. Anna nodded slowly, understanding that James was offering more than just food supplies. He was providing a lesson about human nature and the possibility of redemption that could shape how she and Greta approached their future relationships with the occupation forces and with the wider world. "I will tell Greta about your kindness," Anna promised. "She will learn that enemies can become helpers and that the color of someone's skin says nothing about the content of their character." The promise carried special significance, given the racial propaganda that had been central to German ideology during the conflict. Anna was essentially pledging to counteract years of conditioning that had taught Germans to view African Americans as subhuman threats. Her willingness to credit James's humanity, despite her previous indoctrination, suggested the possibility of broader attitude changes that could support genuine reconciliation. James felt a deep satisfaction at Anna's promise, recognizing that her commitment to teaching Greta about human dignity and individual worth represented a small but significant victory in the larger struggle to build a better world from the ruins of the old one. If one German child could learn to see people as individuals rather than as racial categories, then progress was possible. "Before you go," James said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something else for your daughter." He extracted a Hershey's chocolate bar that had been part of his personal rations, a luxury item that would seem miraculous to a child who had not tasted chocolate in over a year. The gesture was small in practical terms, but enormous in its symbolic significance, representing the difference between mere survival and the small pleasures that made life worth living. Anna accepted the chocolate bar with a reverence that would have been appropriate for a religious relic. "She will not believe that such wonderful things still exist in the world," Anna said, her voice filled with anticipation of her daughter's joy. "Tell her it comes with a promise," James said seriously. "Tell her that the world is going to get better, that she is going to grow up in a place where children do not have to go hungry, where people are judged by their character rather than their nationality or the color of their skin." The promise was ambitious, perhaps overly optimistic given the magnitude of the destruction and hatred that would need to be overcome, but it represented the hope that had motivated James throughout his military service. He believed that the sacrifices of war could be justified only if they led to a genuinely better world for the next generation. Anna felt the weight of that promise, along with the physical weight of the food supplies she carried. James was asking her to believe in and work toward a future that seemed almost impossibly distant from their current circumstances, a world where the kind of generosity he had shown would be normal rather than extraordinary. "I promise to teach her to hope for such a world," Anna said solemnly, "and to help build it however I can." The exchange of promises created a bond between Anna and James that transcended their official roles as German civilian and American occupation force. They had become collaborators in the work of reconstruction and reconciliation, united by shared commitment to human dignity and the welfare of children. James helped Anna position the heavy bags of food supplies so that she could carry them without difficulty, his assistance practical and unobtrusive. "Do you have far to go to reach your daughter?" he asked, concerned about Anna's ability to transport the supplies safely. "About 6 blocks, Anna replied, "but I can manage. I've carried heavier loads when necessary." The statement reflected the physical strength that Anna had developed during months of scavenging and survival, the way that desperate circumstances had transformed a middle-class housewife into someone capable of handling physical challenges that would have defeated her previous self. It also demonstrated her determination to get the food supplies to Greta, regardless of personal difficulty. "Be careful," James advised. "Other patrols might not understand the situation the way I do. If anyone questions you about the supplies, tell them that Corporal Washington conducted an inspection and found everything in order." The guidance provided Anna with a potential defense if she were stopped by other American personnel, though it also represented additional risk for James if his superiors discovered his creative interpretation of inspection procedures. His willingness to accept that risk for Anna's benefit demonstrated the depth of his commitment to helping her and Greta. Anna gathered the bags of food supplies and prepared to leave the basement storage area, her movements careful and deliberate as she adjusted to the weight and bulk of her precious cargo. "Corporal Washington," she said, using his name for the first time, "you have given my daughter a chance to grow up healthy and strong. I will never forget what you have done for us." "Just take care of her," James replied simply. "That is all the thanks I need." Anna made her way carefully through the basement and toward the damaged entrance through which she had originally entered the building. The return journey would be more challenging due to the weight of the supplies, but she felt stronger and more hopeful than she had in months. The encounter with James had restored her faith in the possibility of human kindness and had given her concrete resources to address Greta's nutritional needs. James watched Anna leave with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had solved an immediate problem and potentially saved a child's life, but he had also violated multiple military regulations and could face serious consequences if his actions were discovered. The personal risk seemed acceptable when measured against the alternative of allowing a 10-year-old girl to slowly starve while abundance sat unused in storage. After Anna disappeared from view, James conducted a thorough and legitimate inspection of the basement storage area, taking inventory and checking security measures with the professional competence that his training demanded. His official report would note that the facility was secure and that all supplies were properly accounted for. A statement that was technically accurate, despite the creative interpretation of proper distribution procedures. The encounter with Anna Müller had crystallized James's understanding of what the American occupation mission should accomplish. Beyond the immediate goals of preventing renewed German military aggression and establishing democratic institutions, there was a deeper obligation to demonstrate through actions, rather than words, what American values actually meant in practice. Kindness, generosity, and concern for individual welfare needed to be more than abstract principles. They needed to be visible reality that Germans could observe and potentially emulate. James resumed his patrol duties with a renewed sense of purpose. His understanding of his role expanded beyond simple enforcement of regulations to include active promotion of human dignity and reconciliation. He had learned that individual actions could have profound impacts on people's perceptions and attitudes, that small acts of kindness could challenge years of indoctrination and prejudice. The rest of James's patrol passed without incident, though he found himself more attentive to signs of civilian distress and need. The encounter with Anna had heightened his awareness of the desperation that existed just beneath the surface of apparent normalcy in occupied Frankfurt, the way that official policies and procedures often failed to address the most basic human needs. When James returned to his base that afternoon, he filed his routine patrol report without mentioning the morning's unusual encounter. His official documentation noted the inspection of the Berger Strasse storage facility and confirmed that all security measures were functioning properly. The paperwork reflected his professional competence while concealing the unauthorized distribution of supplies to civilians in need. That evening, as James wrote a letter to his family in Birmingham, he found himself reflecting on the moral complexities of military service and the sometimes conflicting demands of regulations and conscience. He could not share details of the morning's encounter due to security considerations, but he could express his growing understanding of what victory in war actually meant beyond simple military defeat of enemy forces. The letter to his mother included observations about the resilience of civilian populations and the importance of treating former enemies with dignity and respect. James wrote about his conviction that lasting peace could be built only on foundations of mutual understanding and recognition of shared humanity. He did not mention Anna Müller or Greta by name, but their story influenced every word of his reflection on the occupation mission and its ultimate purpose. Meanwhile, Anna Müller made her way through the bombed-out streets of Frankfurt with her precious cargo, her progress slow but steady as she navigated debris-strewn paths and avoided the main thoroughfares where American patrols might question her about the obviously American food supplies she carried. The weight of the bags made her journey difficult, but the knowledge of Greta's reaction to such abundance gave her strength to continue despite her own fatigue and weakness. The 6-block journey from the bakery to their cellar refuge took Anna nearly 2 hours, not only due to the physical challenge of carrying the supplies, but also because of her need to avoid detection by other American personnel who might not understand or approve of James's unauthorized generosity. She traveled through back alleys and damaged buildings, following routes that she had learned during months of scavenging and foraging. When Anna finally reached the partially destroyed apartment building that housed their underground home, she paused outside the entrance to compose herself and prepare for Greta's reaction to the miraculous abundance she had obtained. The child had learned to moderate her hopes and expectations as a survival mechanism, protecting herself from disappointment by assuming that circumstances would remain difficult indefinitely. Anna descended the makeshift stairs that led to their cellar refuge, the bags of food supplies bumping against the narrow walls as she maneuvered through the confined space. She could see Greta sitting on their improvised bed, reading a damaged book that Anna had salvaged from the ruins of a destroyed library. The child's concentration on the page demonstrated her hunger for mental stimulation as well as physical nourishment. "Mama!" Greta exclaimed when she noticed Anna's return, her voice carrying joy and relief that reflected the constant anxiety of separation in uncertain times. "You were gone so long. I was worried that something had happened to you." Anna set down the heavy bags carefully, her movements deliberate as she prepared to reveal the extent of their good fortune. "Something wonderful has happened, Greta," she said softly, her voice carrying excitement that she had learned to suppress during months of disappointment and hardship. "We have been given a gift by someone who wanted to help us." Greta's eyes widened as Anna began removing items from the first bag, revealing an abundance of food that seemed almost supernatural to a child who had grown accustomed to constant hunger. Canned milk, dried fruit, chocolate, meat, vegetables, and other luxuries appeared in sequence, each item representing weeks of improved nutrition and the possibility of normal growth and development. "Is this real, Mama?" Greta whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "Where did all this wonderful food come from?" Anna sat beside her daughter on their improvised bed, gathering the child close as she prepared to share the story of her encounter with James Washington and the lesson about human nature that his kindness represented. It came from an American soldier who understood that hungry children need food more than armies need to guard every can of milk and piece of chocolate. The explanation was simple but profound in its implications for Greta's understanding of the world and the people in it. Anna was teaching her daughter that enemies could become helpers, that prejudice and hatred were not inevitable, and that individual character mattered more than nationality or race. "Was he kind to you, Mama?" Greta asked, her question reflecting both curiosity and the protective concern that children often develop for their parents during times of hardship. "He was very kind," Anna replied, her voice warm with remembered gratitude. "He was a Black American Marine named Corporal Washington, and he gave us this food because he wanted to help you grow strong and healthy. He also gave me this special gift just for you." Anna produced the Hershey's chocolate bar that James had provided from his personal rations, presenting it to Greta with the ceremony appropriate for a precious treasure. The child's reaction exceeded even Anna's expectations, her face lighting up with joy that seemed to illuminate their dim underground refuge. "Chocolate," Greta breathed, her voice filled with wonder as she carefully examined the wrapper. "Real chocolate. I thought I would never taste chocolate again." Anna watched her daughter's reaction with tears in her eyes, understanding that James's gift represented more than simple nutrition or momentary pleasure. The chocolate bar symbolized hope, the possibility that life could include joy and sweetness, as well as mere survival. It demonstrated that there were still people in the world who cared about the happiness of children they had never met. "There is something important I need to tell you about Corporal Washington," Anna continued, recognizing the educational opportunity that James had provided, along with the material assistance. "Before the war, we were taught that black people were our enemies, that they were inferior and dangerous. But Corporal Washington showed us that those teachings were lies." Greta listened carefully to her mother's words, her young mind processing concepts that would have seemed impossibly complex just hours earlier. He was not inferior, was he, Mama? He was kind and generous and good. "He was all of those things," Anna confirmed, proud of her daughter's quick understanding and moral clarity. "He showed us that people should be judged by their actions and their character, not by the color of their skin or their nationality. That is a lesson we must never forget." The conversation represented a profound shift in the worldview that Anna was transmitting to her daughter, a rejection of the racial ideology that had been central to German education and culture during the war years. Anna was teaching Greta to evaluate people as individuals rather than as representatives of groups, a lesson that could shape the child's entire approach to human relationships. Over the following days, Anna carefully rationed the food supplies that James had provided, ensuring that Greta received optimal nutrition while making the abundance last as long as possible. The improvement in the child's energy, mood, and physical appearance was dramatic and immediate. Color returned to Greta's pale cheeks, her movements became more animated, and she began to display the curiosity and playfulness that had been suppressed by months of malnutrition. The transformation in Greta's condition created a ripple effect throughout their small underground community. Other families living in the damaged building noticed the child's improved health and began asking Anna about sources of additional food supplies. Anna shared what information she could while protecting James's identity and avoiding details that might compromise his position. Anna's story of unexpected kindness from an American soldier, told carefully and without identifying specifics, began to spread through the informal networks of communication that connected Frankfurt's displaced and desperate populations. The tale of generosity and human compassion provided hope and encouragement to people who had begun to believe that kindness had disappeared from the world entirely. The psychological impact of James's actions extended far beyond the immediate nutritional benefits for Greta. Anna found herself viewing American occupation forces with less suspicion and more willingness to seek assistance when needed. She began to believe that cooperation rather than resistance might offer the best path toward rebuilding her life and securing her daughter's future. 3 weeks after their encounter, Anna made a decision that would have seemed impossible before meeting James Washington. She approached an American administrative office to inquire about employment opportunities that might allow her to earn money for food and housing rather than relying on scavenging and occasional charity. Her willingness to trust American authorities was a direct result of her experience with James's kindness and integrity. The American personnel at the administrative office were initially skeptical of Anna's application, given the general policy of minimal fraternization with German civilians. However, her obvious desperation and her polite, respectful approach eventually resulted in a position helping with translation services for other German civilians seeking assistance from occupation authorities. The job provided Anna with a small but steady income that, combined with their official rations, was sufficient to rent a small apartment above ground for herself and Greta. The move from their underground refuge to actual housing represented a dramatic improvement in their living conditions and their prospects for long-term stability and recovery. Hannah's new position also placed her in contact with other American military personnel, some of whom demonstrated the same fundamental decency and concern for civilian welfare that James had shown. She gradually developed working relationships with occupation authorities who came to trust her honesty and appreciate her skill at communicating with German civilians who needed assistance. Through her translation work, Anna learned that James Washington's compassionate approach to civilian relations was not unique among American forces. Many American military personnel were genuinely committed to helping German civilians rebuild their lives and their country, though regulations and caution often prevented them from acting as directly as James had done. Hannah never saw James Washington again during her months of working with American occupation forces, though she often wondered about his welfare and whether he had faced consequences for his unauthorized distribution of military supplies. She hoped that his kindness had been appreciated rather than punished, and that he had continued to find ways to help people in need. The chocolate bar that James had given to Greta became a treasured possession that the child kept long after eating the chocolate itself. The wrapper, carefully preserved and occasionally displayed, served as a tangible reminder of the day when an enemy had become a helper, when prejudice had been replaced by understanding, when kindness had triumphed over hatred. As Greta grew older and stronger, nourished by the food that James had provided and the lesson about human dignity that his actions had taught, she often asked Anna to retell the story of their encounter with the Black American Marine who had chosen compassion over regulation, humanity over bureaucracy. The tale became part of the family's oral history, a reminder of the difference that individual kindness could make in desperate circumstances. The story of Anna and Greta Mueller's encounter with James Washington represented something larger than a single act of charity or a brief moment of cross-cultural understanding. It demonstrated the possibility of healing and reconciliation even in the aftermath of total war, the capacity of individual actions to challenge systemic hatred and prejudice. For James Washington, the decision to help a hungry German mother and her daughter became a defining moment in his understanding of what military service and American values actually meant. His willingness to risk personal consequences for the sake of human decency set a standard for his own behavior that influenced his approach to every subsequent challenge and opportunity. The encounter taught James that true victory in war required more than military defeat of enemy forces. Lasting peace could be built only on foundations of mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity, goals that could be achieved only through countless individual acts of understanding and compassion between former enemies. James continued his service with the occupation forces for another 8 months, completing his tour of duty with a record of professionalism and dedication that earned respect from superiors and colleagues. His approach to civilian relations, while never again as directly dramatic as his encounter with Anna, consistently reflected his commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect. When James returned to the United States in June 1946, he carried with him a profound understanding of the complexity of international relations and the importance of individual character in shaping historical events. His experience in occupied Germany had taught him that peace was not simply the absence of war, but the active presence of justice, understanding, and mutual respect between peoples. The lessons that James learned in Frankfurt influenced his civilian career as an educator in Birmingham, where he worked to promote understanding and cooperation across racial and cultural barriers. His teaching emphasized the importance of evaluating people as individuals rather than as representatives of groups, a message that had particular relevance during the civil rights struggles of the following decades. James never forgot Anna and Greta Müller, often wondering about their long-term welfare and whether the food he had provided had made a meaningful difference in their lives. He hoped that his small act of kindness had contributed to their survival and recovery, and that the lesson about human dignity had influenced their approach to relationships with people from different backgrounds. The story of their encounter became one that James shared carefully with students and colleagues when discussing the importance of individual moral courage and the possibility of building understanding across traditional barriers of race and nationality. He used their example to illustrate the difference between following regulations blindly and serving higher principles of human welfare and dignity. Anna Müller's life in post-war Germany gradually stabilized as the country began its long process of reconstruction and democratization. Her work with American occupation forces led to permanent employment with German-American cultural exchange programs, where her experience bridging language and cultural barriers proved invaluable for promoting understanding between former enemies. Greta Müller grew into adulthood with a deep appreciation for the diversity of human experience and character, shaped by her childhood encounter with unexpected kindness from someone she had been taught to fear and hate. Her understanding of James Washington's generosity influenced her own approach to relationships across cultural and racial boundaries throughout her life. As an adult, Greta became a teacher herself, working in schools that served children from many different backgrounds and nationalities. She often told her students about the American Marine who had chosen to help a hungry German child, using the story to illustrate the importance of individual kindness and the possibility of finding common ground, even with people who might seem to be enemies. The chocolate bar wrapper that Greta had preserved since childhood eventually found its way into a small museum dedicated to German-American reconciliation in the post-war period. The simple piece of paper became a symbol of the individual acts of kindness and understanding that had made possible the transformation of former enemies into allies and friends. The broader historical significance of encounters like the one between James Washington and Anna Müller lay in their demonstration that lasting peace required more than formal treaties and official policies. Real reconciliation happened at the level of individual human relationships, through countless acts of generosity, understanding, and mutual recognition of shared humanity. The transformation of Germany from defeated enemy to trusted ally was built on thousands of such encounters, moments when American military personnel chose compassion over suspicion, when German civilians responded to kindness with gratitude rather than resentment, when both sides recognized that their shared hopes for peace and prosperity mattered more than their past antagonisms. James Washington's decision to help a hungry German mother and her daughter was significant, not because it was unique, but because it was representative of a larger pattern of individual moral courage and human decency that shaped the post-war world. His willingness to risk personal consequences for the sake of human welfare demonstrated the kind of character that made democracy and freedom possible. The story of Anna Müller's desperate theft of food supplies and James Washington's compassionate response illustrated fundamental truths about human nature and the possibility of moral choice, even in the most difficult circumstances. Both Anna and James faced situations that tested their character, and both chose actions that reflected their deepest values rather than their immediate self-interest or their learned prejudices. Anna's willingness to risk severe punishment for the sake of her daughter's welfare demonstrated the power of parental love to overcome fear and social conditioning. Her desperate act of theft was transformed by James's response into an opportunity for learning and growth for both herself and her daughter. James's decision to provide help rather than punishment demonstrated the possibility of individual moral agency, even within hierarchical military structures. His choice to prioritize human need over military regulations illustrated the difference between following orders blindly and serving higher principles of justice and human dignity. The encounter between Anna and James challenged stereotypes and prejudices on both sides, creating an opportunity for genuine understanding between people who had been conditioned to view each other as enemies. Their interaction demonstrated that shared humanity could overcome artificial barriers of race and nationality when people chose to see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of hostile groups. The long-term impact of their encounter extended far beyond its immediate practical benefits. Anna's changed attitude toward American occupation forces influenced her interactions with other military personnel and her approach to post-war reconstruction. Greta's childhood lesson about human dignity shaped her lifelong approach to relationships across cultural boundaries. James's experience with Anna and Greta deepened his understanding of the moral responsibilities that came with power and authority, influencing his approach to leadership throughout his military service and civilian career. His willingness to take personal risk for the sake of human welfare set a standard that guided his decisions in numerous subsequent challenges. The story of their encounter became part of the larger narrative of post-war reconciliation, contributing to the gradual transformation of former enemies into allies and friends. Their individual act of kindness and understanding was replicated thousands of times across occupied Germany, creating the foundation for lasting peace and cooperation between the United States and Germany. The historical significance of James Washington's compassionate response to Anna Mueller's desperate situation lay in its demonstration that individual moral courage could triumph over systemic hatred and prejudice. His refusal to be guided by racial stereotypes or military regulations when faced with genuine human need illustrated the possibility of choosing humanity over bureaucracy, understanding over suspicion. The preservation of their story, through Greta's memories and the simple chocolate bar wrapper that symbolized unexpected kindness, ensured that future generations could learn from their example of the difference that individual actions could make in shaping historical events. Their encounter demonstrated that ordinary people, facing moral choices in extraordinary circumstances, had the power to influence the course of human events through simple acts of decency and compassion. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.